every time you see Putin do a nuclear launch, it's because he feels he's in the crosshairs, and he is in the crosshairs in a lot of ways with this latest potential assassination attempt, or not so much an attempt, but collusion that's potentially happening out of London. He's in the crosshairs because his military is having setbacks. He was out there claiming that Pokrovsk was taken, but Zelenskyy was saying not so fast, it's not fallen yet. He's having an economic meltdown that we can get into later with respect to his banking system that could be just as bad as the global meltdown between 2007 and 9 in terms of how it impacts Russia internally. He's getting his oil and energy sector is under immense pressure due to Ukrainian deep strike attacks. And he's got economic sanctions that you could penalize him as much as $30 to $50 billion a year, and that's on revenues of $400 billion. So that's significant. So he's definitely in the crosshairs, and I think he's absolutely wide open for a coup to potentially happen. But who that could be and how that would happen, we just don't know yet. At this point, they're trying to hunker down, and I think the fact that he's marched out nukes, this nuclear test that just happened 2 days ago, is indication of that he's concerned, that he's worried, and he's trying to message that I'm still strong, even though in a lot of ways he's messaging that he's weak.
You just mentioned also about this nuclear test. Russian army has launched a nuclear missile during this tests, which were observed personally by Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Moreover, he was wearing a military uniform, brand new one. Mark, what is your assessment of this new nuclear threats from Vladimir Putin and his also his new announcement of brand new Burevestnik missile with so-called unlimited range?
Yeah, Daniel, when you have to announce something like that, it tells you it's probably not as good as advertised. And when you have to dress up or cosplay, as younger generations call it, by wearing military uniforms, it's suggestive that he really wants that messaging to get through, but it's also a sign of weakness. John and I were joking offline that we really need to come up with, you've got the 5 Pinocchios to call out politicians who lie. John and I need to come up with the 5 nukes to show you what level that Putin is trying to bluff here. And I think this one earns 5 nukes because it's a sign of desperation. When he's out there, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, doing these kind of demonstrations with nuclear weapons and the like, dressing up for them, being in a bunker type environment, trying to look serious, trying to say that these are invincible, as if the United States and France and the UK didn't have nuclear weapons of their own. It's a bit laughable from the West, but obviously this is domestic messaging as well. He's trying to allay any fears to his fellow SV types that he's being threatened, and he wants to show that he's still in control. But I think John has seen this before in the military side of things, that when you're weak, you try to display force. So, John, your thoughts on that?
Sure, John.
I agree. Let me just add, there's American holiday, Halloween, 31 October, so it's a little early for putting on costumes and trick-or-treating, but I think that's the image, at least from my perspective, that he presented. Yes, it is exactly as Mark said, when weak presents strength. The difference is I don't believe the West buys it. I don't believe the West buys his comments that it can strike anywhere, it can evade all types of NATO and U.S. air defense systems. Again, as Mark said, if you have to say it, it probably isn't true. But again, the audience isn't the Western audience. The audience is the Russian audience, which, by the way, is beginning to fall out of favor. Primarily because just what Mark said, the ruble is weak. They're noticing the effects in Moscow and St. Petersburg, obviously where the ethnic Russian majority resides, and it's starting to become painful. And yes, he is concerned about losing the popular support, so he needs to create an enemy that he can mobilize against. So yes, it's Ukraine. Yes, it's NATO. Now it's the United States. It's U.S. sanctions. It's the introduction of Tomahawk missiles. It's always something with Putin. So we can expect more of this. And one thing that Mark and I talked about is we can expect purges. He's already tightened his inner circle. We've seen yesterday that he's installed, I believe, his cousin into a significant role within the regime. He's already purged a number of oligarchs. He's already gone into the military and purged military personnel, and he's purged senior civilians within his administration. I think we can expect to see more of that as we start to see this paranoia start to grip and everyone starts to look at one another and report on one another. we're going to see that. And that's, I guess, a very good sign, at least from the West, that failure is coming rapidly to the Putin regime.
And John, what is your take on the technical details of this brand new Burevestnik cruise missile? Because Vladimir Putin says that this missile has unlimited range and can fly for months because of its so-called nuclear-powered engine. What is your assessment of this?
Well, so I'm not a scientist, so I don't necessarily understand all the technical aspects of what he says. But until I hear something from the West, and when I say the West, the United States or NATO, particularly from the Defense Intelligence Agency or other agencies, it may have some capabilities that he presented, but he's overstating the play of this particular weapon system. And loitering capability for weeks or months is, from my perspective, not a reality. There may be some loitering capability, and we have that capability, obviously, with the U.S. Tomahawk missile too, but for a set amount of time. So it's again, it's flexing. It's trying to present a capability that, quite frankly, I'm not sure he has. But as the scientific community takes a look at the particular missile launch and does their analysis, obviously we'll hear more about this probably in the coming days on what exactly the technical aspects of this new weapon system are.
Let's also cover U.S. sanctions against Russia. U.S. has imposed sanctions against Russia's two biggest oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says that these sanctions will really hurt Russian economy, despite recent statements by Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's special representative, and his personal envoy. He also visited U.S. recently and tried to persuade Americans that Russia would not suffer from these sanctions. Mark, what is your take on the real influence of these new sanctions against Russia's two biggest oil companies? Because it seems like they have to sell their assets worldwide.
Yeah, Daniel, let's work backwards with that one. I mean, the fact that Kirill Dmitriev felt like he had to come to the U.S. tells you he isn't worried about the sanctions. He knows, as the head of the Russian Sovereign Fund, exactly how deadly those can be to the Russian economy. Now, obviously, they're a good first step. More is needed, secondary sanctions. They would penalize people buying Russian oil down the road, is what's needed. But he knows that it's significant. Look, he was over here, and he being Dmitriev, to try to push back on Scott Bessent's sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, and it didn't work. It fell flat. He met with a U.S. Congresswoman, Republican, mind you, who sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Her last name is Luna, but it might as well be Lunatic, because she's buying into this propaganda, but thankfully no one else is. Basically, Dmitriev was laughed out of the U.S., sent on his way, and didn't achieve his mission. And then Scott Bessent himself made that clear that, look, Dmitriev can say whatever he wants, but these sanctions are meaningful. And I think to understand the potential that they have on Russia, you really have to step back and understand what's happening with their economy. At this point, 400 billion of the government's revenues are dependent upon coming in from oil and energy contracts. So anything that cuts that undercuts it, is harmful. And there are some estimates that, again, it's just too early to know, that these sanctions alone could have a $30 to $50 billion impact a year. So if you're talking anywhere from 15 to 10% or so of those sanctions taking a bite out of their budget, that's significant. Especially since, as we find out more as this year's developed, it's clear that Russia's been cooking their own books. On the one hand, they say that they're only investing about 250 billion by different accounts into their war economy from a government expenditure standpoint. But what's gone underreported, albeit the Kiev Post has done a good job of it, so has Harvard's Craig Kennedy, who's reported a lot on this. You have Russia that's actually been putting immense pressure on their banking system to make what are really bad loans. And that probably as much as another $300 million in terms of that. So you've got Russia sitting out there significantly indebted. It's probably led to stagflation. That's when you have no growth but inflation. Their inflation rate right now is about 8%. Their interest rates at 16.5%, slightly down. And so really their economy is basically hitting a ceiling at this point. And you've got this big bad loan portfolio, all these loans that have been given to Russian defense contracts. If the war ends, they're belly up. There's no more revenue coming in to pay these things off. So Putin in many ways is in the crosshairs, and these sanctions aren't going to help. It's just one more domino that's starting to collapse Russia's economy. And then, oh yeah, just very quickly here, you've got what Ukrainians doing to the oil and energy sector itself through its deep precision strikes with flamingos and the like. So it's just not good for them at this point. We're starting to see those dominoes tip.
You just mentioned about flamingo missile strikes on Moscow. John, recently Ukraine has launched numerous strikes on Russia's cities, which target more than 15 Russian regions. Ukraine used long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles, Ukraine-made cruise missiles, long-range drones and other interesting missiles, drones targeting Russia's military infrastructure. Also, US green-lighted these strikes with Western-made cruise missile, particularly British-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles. What is your assessment of this new stage of war, John?
Well, it's not a new stage of war, but it is exploiting success. Okay, they have found the weakness, and the weakness is Russia's air defense capability. And it is by design, by the way. They have taken, the better part of the last 12 to 36 months to strike Russian air defense assets throughout Russia in order to weaken their early response or their early alert, and then also their ability to shoot down those particular missiles. So it's been deliberate. They've gone after air defense. Now they're actually going after infrastructure. Look, Ukraine's hit 21 of Russia's 38 largest refineries where their crude oil is refined. So Ukrainian sanctions are having an effect. It's also been hitting military targets, obviously in Crimea, and also plants, industrial plants, plants where drone missiles are being produced, and ammunition storage facilities. So interdiction combined with those deep strikes to affect their ability to fund the war is having an impact. And now, as Mark and I have stated in other articles, I'll throw another analogy out there. It's called the Jenga tower. It used to be a popular game in the 80s and the 90s where you remove pieces of the tower until it collapsed. Not one piece itself, obviously, is more important than the other, but the introduction of U.S. sanctions could be that one piece that's removed from the tower that collapses the regime. So more to follow clearly, but the Ukrainian version of sanctions is having a direct impact, not only on Russia's military capacity, but also on Russian civilians.
Also, recently, Ukraine has struck a Russian dam in Belgorod region, and this strike caused a really harmful effect for Russian positions on the ground, which were flooded, and several brigades had to withdraw from this area. Several also brigades were encircled and left without any kind of logistical supply. What is your assessment of this tactical move by Ukraine, John?
Well, so in an intelligence view of this, we do something called intelligence preparation in the battlefield when we're doing our analysis, both of the enemy, of the weather, and the terrain. So obviously the Ukrainian intelligence analysts determined based upon where Russian positions were located and based upon the geolocation of that particular dam, that if they took out the dam, that they could move or defeat those forces without having to use weapons to move them. And they created an obstacle for further use, but also they were able to get the Russian forces to move. Russian forces are most vulnerable, obviously, when they move. So as they are moving, they're vulnerable to airstrikes, particularly drone strikes. So another way in which the Ukrainian military is using innovation and technology to defeat Russian ground forces in Ukraine.
And Mark, US President Donald Trump still believes that he can bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table. What are the current stage of negotiations? How close we are to any kind of ceasefire deal?
Yeah, Daniel, I think to the extent that Trump at this point is saying that he's still confident that he can reach a ceasefire agreement, that's more marketing to his base, his political base. I think he gets the reality on the ground right now that Putin is not ready to have any kind of meaningful discussion. And we've seen that. The statements that Kirill Dmitriev made while here in the U.S. is indicative of it. Lavrov just yesterday was basically saying, look, our maximalist demands remain. We want everyone to admit that NATO is the one that caused this war by trying to encroach upon Eastern Europe, if you will, to be, quote unquote, on our doorsteps. Putin is nowhere near it. Plus, to use an old analogy from a play at one point, there's this line that says that, I have to pay the rent, but I can't pay the rent. Meant you're caught in a classic catch-22. That's where Putin is at right now. He's gone so far into this war. He's overcommitted his military. He's overcommitted his economy, and he's overcommitted his own person as a leader to this war that he doesn't know how to get out of it. If he stops, his economy likely collapses. And if his economy collapses, he's likely purged. If he loses, he likely loses the confidence of his military. And if he loses the confidence of his military, the FSB may feel like they've got to have a stronger leader. And instead of the FSB warning about what the gentleman, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, might be doing in London with the anti-war committee, they may be doing their own coup. So Putin is pressured on all corners here. I just don't see him at this point saying negotiating is my best way of personal survival. So sadly, I think he's going to continue this maximalist approach because he has no way out. It just is this classic scenario where he has to pay the rent, meaning he has to somehow figure out how to keep his neck out of a noose, but he doesn't know how, and so he can't pay the rent. And so
hey, Daniel, let me add one point, Daniel, to that. Okay. I'll add one point. It's not enough to bring him to the table. Okay. It's to bring Putin to the table on conditions that are favorable to Ukraine. Okay. So that means to continue to apply pressure upon him to get him to accept conditions that he would not normally accept. You can't come to the table and say, okay, now we're going to freeze the lines and you can keep the Donbass. We're going to freeze the lines and you're going to withdraw from Russia. It has to be on conditions favorable to Ukraine, not just to stop the war.
Also, according to Wall Street Journal, there are different intelligence assessment of Vladimir Putin's willingness or unwillingness to settle this war. U.S. Department of State's inner intelligence believes that Vladimir Putin is not yet ready to bring this war to the end. However, CIA has more positive assessment of Putin's willingness to settle the war. CIA also believes that President Trump can bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table and force him to agree with ceasefire deal. Mark, my question would be, why are there different assessments of Putin's willingness to end the war, and which assessment is more credible for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think it's clear. You just need to look at your own front lines. You need to look at the innocent Ukrainian civilians being bombed every day. Putin is nowhere near deciding that he's going to negotiate a peace. You just simply have to listen to Lavrov himself saying that he still wants to blame NATO for all of this, that it's not Russia's fault. In terms of the CIA versus other intelligence agencies, look, there could be an internal dispute. There could be intended messaging there. They may want to confuse and get this out there to Putin to say, look, there's two wings in the U.S. that are currently arguing whether or not you're serious about negotiations. It could be an off-ramp for him to say, oh, wait, I need to side with the so-called CIA sources. Or it could just be an internal dispute that happens with, deep state, if you will, to use the political terminology here in the U.S., where one side feels the other side has it wrong, and this is playing out. John can probably speak more to that than I can. But personally, my own view is we're not anywhere close to Putin being willing to negotiate a ceasefire, let alone a permanent peace here. This is still something that he believes he can't get out of. And until his cost calculus changes, and frankly, until Russia's cost calculus changes, I think that's got to be the new paradigm here that John and I advocate for, and others, that it's just not enough to change Putin's cost calculus anymore. We've got to change the country so that some entity like the FSB realizes Putin has to go. That's probably the likeliest way this war ends, not necessarily the negotiating table, and not necessarily anytime soon in the battlefield, even though I hope that, one way or the other, it ends sooner than later.
Sure, John. And what is your assessment of these controversies behind intelligence assessment of Putin's state of mind and his calculus?
Yeah, you're never going to get consensus within the intelligence community, okay? So what you have at CIA and what you have at State Department, you're looking at probably different sources. And not probably, you're looking at different sources. State Department's using firsthand sources based upon the meetings and discussions that they've had with Putin's entourage, Putin's advisors, Putin's if you will, negotiators, whereas the CIA is probably using second and third-hand sources from information gained from meetings that may have occurred backstage. I'd be interested in what the DIA has to say or what NSA has to say. But again, there is never going to be consensus within the intelligence community, quite frankly, because they're looking at different sources. I think they all agree on one thing, that just as Mark said, that Putin's in the crosshairs. Putin's at a point now where he doesn't trust people, exceptionally paranoid. The FSB is closing the gates around him, and he's vulnerable. And because of that vulnerability, he may take actions of what we would call an unreasonable actor. And hopefully within the Putin administration, people would step up and stop that. So we're at a dangerous time of him being in the crosshairs, and we'll just have to wait to see what the intelligence assessment is from the intelligence community, and that would come out of ODNI versus individual intelligence agencies.
Hey, Daniel, if I could quickly add here.
Sure.
I think it's important to note that the State Department now is obviously being run by Marco Rubio, and this is a Russia hawk. This is not a guy that looks kindly to Moscow. It's been widely reported of late that he's, against any kind of capitulation, if you will, to Russia, and that he's behind some people being critical of him, that he's trying to stop any meaningful kind of negotiations. And I suspect he is, because he realizes these are bad negotiations. So the fact that his State Department is coming out to be more hawkish tells me where his mindset is at. And frankly, I would believe him at this point. His point people are the ones that have been in touch with the Russians of late, negotiating with them in Moscow and elsewhere. And I think he knows the lay of the land better than what you might get from the human intelligence side on as John pointed out, a second and a third basis, from CIA sources. But that's just my take.